A lone dog refused to leave a mysterious bag. What's inside changed an officer's life forever. The rain poured mercilessly that night, the drops pounding against the pavement like tiny hammers. Dark clouds stretched across the sky, casting a shadowy veil over the desolate road. Somewhere in the chill of the evening, a young woman clutched her belly, bent over as waves of pain surged through her. Alone, on the edge of some forgotten town, she had no one beside her but a dog, her faithful companion, Laika. The dog paced back and forth, ears pricked, eyes wide, sensing the urgency that crackled in the air. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Laika moved closer, nudging her with his wet nose as though to steady her. She gasped, gripping a lamppost for support, her breaths shallow and panicked. The wind howled, wrapping around her like a ghostly whisper, as if echoing the dread that had settled in her heart. And then, through the sound of rain and thunder, there was another sound, a piercing cry, raw and new, slicing through the midnight silence. A child's cry, the desperate wail of a newborn who had just taken its first breath. Trembling, the woman wrapped the fragile infant in a thin, worn blanket and put him in a large cloth bag. Her hands shook as she held her child, gazing down at him, her eyes filled with a sorrow that ran too deep for words. She was drenched, rain mingling with the tears on her face as she leaned down, brushing her lips against the child's forehead. Her lips parted, but her words came out as a murmur, barely audible over the rain. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." She glanced down at Laika, who was watching her with those intense, understanding eyes. The dog seemed to sense what was coming, though perhaps he didn't fully understand. She looked back at her child, her voice barely above a whisper. "Laika," she said, her gaze hardening as she spoke, "you stay here. Protect him. Don't leave him." Laika whined softly, his eyes darting between the woman and the baby. He nudged closer, his body pressing against the woman as if to convince her to stay, to not leave him with this heavy task. But she stood, stepping back with a resolve that spoke of decisions made and bridges burned. She gave Laika one last, long look, then turned and disappeared into the night, swallowed up by shadows and the relentless rain. Laika whimpered, watching her silhouette fade, his large, shaggy frame shaking as he remained planted beside the child. He didn't understand her reasons, but he understood loyalty. He was a dog, after all, bound by a code as ancient as time. So, despite the ache in his heart, he settled down next to the bag that held the infant, curling his body around it to shield the baby from the bitter rain. Hours passed, and the storm raged on. Laika lay still, guarding the child as if he were his own. His ears twitched at every sound, his eyes scanning the shadows. The night was long, filled with the relentless drumming of rain, the shudder of cold wind, and the steady, fragile breaths of the newborn nestled in the bag. The hours stretched on, and Laika never moved, never left his post. Morning dawned grey and dreary, with the remnants of the storm lingering in the air. The streets were empty, coated in a thin layer of mist, as if nature itself wanted to keep the secret of that night hidden. A patrol car rolled slowly down the street, the headlights cutting through the fog, illuminating the silhouette of a large dog hunched over something on the sidewalk. Officer Haley Stanton squinted, her brows furrowing as she caught sight of the dog. It was large, and from where she sat in the car it looked wild, feral even, guarding what appeared to be a dirty, blood-stained bag. Her hand tightened instinctively on her radio, calling in a backup unit while she watched the scene unfold. As she approached cautiously, Laika's ears perked up. His eyes locked onto hers, fierce and protective, and he let out a low growl, his stance unwavering. Haley held up her hands, moving slowly, her voice calm and steady. "Easy there, boy," she murmured. "I'm not here to hurt you." Laika's growling softened, but his body remained tense, as if he understood her words, but still couldn't trust her intentions. Haley could see the look in his eyes, a mix of suspicion and something deeper, perhaps a hint of sadness. Slowly she edged closer, crouching down to his level, her gaze soft and unthreatening. Laika seemed to hesitate, and then, almost imperceptibly, he relaxed, his growls fading to a soft whimper. Taking a deep breath, Haley reached for the bag, her fingers shaking slightly as she pulled it open. Her heart lurched as she saw what lay inside, a tiny, fragile baby wrapped in a thin, damp blanket, his cheeks pale but breathing. She felt her breath catch, her chest tightening as 1,000 questions flooded her mind. Who would leave a child out here, alone in the storm? And why? Haley glanced back at Laika, who now sat quietly beside her, his eyes full of a sadness she couldn't quite comprehend. She knew she had to act quickly. "We've got you now," she whispered to the baby, her voice thick with emotion. In that moment, she made a silent promise to this child, and to the dog who had stayed by his side all night, that she would uncover the truth, no matter where it led. The emergency room was humming with the early stir of the day as Haley and her team arrived with the infant bundled tightly in a hospital blanket. Laika, the scruffy protector, had followed them all the way from the alley, and now he stood just outside the glass doors, his eyes locked on the baby with an intensity that would have made even the most hardened officers pause. Haley glanced at the dog through the door as she handed the baby over to the nurse, her fingers lingering for just a moment on the blanket. She hadn't held a baby in years, but something about this one, coupled with Laika's loyalty, made her hesitate. The nurse nodded, sensing the unspoken attachment, and took the child gently. "Laika's not moving from that door," Jason noted, following Haley's gaze to the dog standing as still as a sentry. "Might as well be a statue." "He's doing what he was told," Haley replied, her voice low. "That dog's been given a job. We'll have to make sure he doesn't feel like it's over yet." Inside the hospital, the infant's cries broke the morning quiet, piercing through the sterile hallways as the doctors and nurses worked swiftly. Haley and Jason waited in the corridor, each lost in their own thoughts. The image of the baby, helpless and alone in the storm, stayed with her. Who could leave a child like that, abandoned to chance? After an hour, the lead nurse approached them, her expression soft but serious. "Malnourished, dehydrated and cold, but nothing we can't address with some care. A lucky find." Lucky, Haley thought grimly. Laika, soaked and fierce in the alley, had likely been the reason the child was still alive at all. She nodded her thanks, exchanging a brief glance with Jason, who gave a nod of approval. With the baby safe for now, Haley's mind turned to finding answers. The story behind the infant's abandonment and Laika's role in it needed to come to light. At the precinct later that morning, Haley held a press conference, appealing to the public for any information on the baby or his family. As cameras flashed and reporters leaned forward with anticipation, Haley presented the facts: a newborn, a stormy night, and an abandoned bag, all watched over by a fiercely protective stray. She felt the weight of her words landing on the room like stones into water, creating ripples of curiosity and speculation. "Detective Stanton, does the department believe this was a case of abandonment, or is foul play suspected?" a reporter from the Daily News asked, his pen poised above his notebook. Haley hesitated, carefully choosing her response. Right now, Our priority is to find the child's family and understand the circumstances. We hope someone who knows the family will come forward soon." The story took on a life of its own within hours, flooding local news and social media. The baby, nicknamed Storm Baby by an intrepid reporter, became a headline sensation, his story amplified by the steadfast loyalty of Lika. People shared photos of the dog's intense, watchful gaze and speculated wildly on the child's parentage. From the beginning, Haley had anticipated public interest, but the depth of the response was unexpected. Each like, share, and comment seemed to compound her responsibility toward the child and toward Lika. That evening, Haley found herself scrolling through articles and threads about the story, her chest tight with worry. Every theory, from tragic loss to conspiracy, tugged her thoughts in different directions. But as the hours slipped by, there was still no breakthrough, no missing persons report, no grieving parents searching for their baby. Then, a call came in. A woman had arrived at the precinct, claiming to be the baby's mother. Haley met her in the waiting area, studying the woman as she approached. Slim and pale with a strained look, the woman clutched a worn purse to her chest, her eyes darting around the room as if fearing judgment. "Detective Stanton?" she asked in a small voice, avoiding Haley's eyes. "That's me," Haley said, giving a slight nod. She gestured to a chair nearby, indicating the woman should sit. "Please, make yourself comfortable. You're here about the baby?" The woman nodded, her expression hardening with conviction. "Yes, he's mine." Her voice was quiet, almost wavering, but Haley caught a flicker of something else. Fear? Guilt? It was too soon to say. "What happened, Mum? Why was he left in an alley with only a dog to watch over him?" Haley kept her tone even, though her words carried weight. The woman's face went blank, her hands tightening around her purse. I don't think that's relevant. I just want my baby back." She looked down, her voice faltering. Haley's instincts tingled. Something here wasn't right. Haley kept her face neutral. "Of course, but we'll need some identification, and—" As Haley spoke, a sharp bark from outside the precinct's glass doors cut through the air. Lika's howl was loud and furious, like he sensed the truth hidden beneath the woman's nervous composure. Haley's gaze snapped to the door, where Lika stood, eyes blazing and fur bristling, focused squarely on the woman. The woman stiffened, glancing over her shoulder at the dog as if he were some messenger of fate. Haley raised her eyebrows. "Is everything all right?" The woman swallowed, her grip on her purse tightening as she muttered, Yes, it's fine." But her voice had lost all steadiness, and in that moment, Haley knew her doubts were no longer hers alone. The investigation into the baby's origins had only just begun. The morning had unfolded slowly, weighed down by grey skies and a sense of unease Haley couldn't shake. She stood in the hospital hallway with her arms crossed, watching through the glass, as a woman approached the baby she had claimed as her own. Lika, the stray who had guarded the child, sat at the base of the crib, alert and unblinking. He had grown restless as the woman neared, his paws shifting on the floor. When she leaned in, his patience snapped. Lika lunged forward, barking fiercely, his body coiled with the intensity of a silent warning. The woman froze, her hands raised defensively, a glint of fear in her eyes. Whoa, easy there," one of the officers called out as he moved in to pull Lika back, gripping the dog's collar with firm hands. Lika resisted, his eyes never leaving the woman, his deep, guttural growl filling the room as though he knew something everyone else didn't. Haley watched, her instincts prickling. She stepped closer, eyeing the woman who had taken a shaky step back, her expression shifting from fear to irritation. You sure he's all right to be around people? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but Haley caught the thin edge of nerves behind it. He's been calm all morning, Haley replied evenly, crouching beside Laika and resting a calming hand on his shoulder. The dog's got good instincts. Let's just make sure we know the truth, okay? The woman's smile wavered, barely concealing a flash of impatience. Truth? You think I'm lying? She laughed, though the sound was strained. I'm his mother. Can't I just take him home? Haley's eyes narrowed as she observed her carefully. Laika's reaction wasn't something she could ignore. We'll need to run a quick DNA test, she said, keeping her voice steady but firm. Just a formality, of course. For a second, the woman's face went blank, her composure slipping in a way that spoke louder than any words she could have said. She looked to the door, her fingers twitching slightly. DNA test? Isn't that a bit much? I just want my baby. Haley's expression remained impassive, though inside she felt a confirmation of her gut instinct. It won't take long, she assured her. Just enough for us to be absolutely certain he's going where he belongs. The woman's gaze darted around, searching for something, maybe for someone who would intercede, offer her a reprieve. She forced a brittle smile, a poor mask for her growing discomfort. Well, I suppose... if it's necessary. But her eyes didn't meet Haley's. She adjusted the scarf around her neck, took one last look at the child, and turned quickly, heading toward the door with her shoulders hunched, as though retreating from an unseen threat. Haley exhaled slowly, her eyes following the woman's hurried steps. She scratched Laika's head, murmuring, "Good dog," and Laika seemed to relax, leaning his head against her hand. The officers exchanged looks, the collective tension easing as the woman disappeared down the hallway. Laika's warning had saved them from a serious mistake, and Haley couldn't shake the feeling of relief mixed with a deepening respect for the dog. "Looks like you've got a talent for sniffing out trouble, Laika," she said, a small smile flickering on her face. Word of Laika's intervention spread through the hospital like wildfire. Staff and patients alike were intrigued by the loyal dog's protective instincts, and soon he had become something of a minor celebrity. Nurses would bring him treats, and doctors would take moments from their rounds to scratch his head and commend him. Even the patients took notice, many stopping by to catch a glimpse of the dog that had saved the little boy twice now. Haley noticed how even the smallest children would gather around Laika, their faces lighting up as they stroked his thick fur, some whispering stories of their own pets back home. Laika seemed to welcome the attention, but remained focused, his eyes often drifting back to the infant's crib, vigilant as ever. Meanwhile, the boy grew stronger each day. His cheeks, once pallid and sallow, now held a healthy tint. He had grown into a curious baby, often reaching his hands through the crib bars, grasping for whatever came into view. Haley would visit him daily, watching him with an affection that had surprised her at first. She couldn't quite explain it. She'd met countless children over the years, but something about this one struck a chord. "He's on the mend," one of the nurses told Haley with a smile, catching her gazing at the child. "Give it another week, and he'll be ready to leave here." Haley nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction at the nurse's words. It was good news, though a small part of her couldn't help but wonder where he would end up. She knew the system well enough to worry. Laika, sensing the child's nearing release, seemed almost restless, his brown eyes fixed on the crib whenever they were in the room. Haley knelt down beside him, ruffling his ears. "You're a hero now, Laika. Looks like you'll be getting more treats than you know what to do with." He licked her hand, his eyes softening, but she could see the worry in them, the kind that held no language, yet spoke clearly. The days turned slowly in the quiet hum of the hospital, each one marked by a quiet ritual. Every morning, Laika, the scruffy, grey-muzzled dog, waited faithfully by the door as the nurses filed in and out. He'd sit, watching with eyes alert, shifting only to stretch his legs, or to nose at the glass door if he felt a moment of worry. He hadn't left his post by the nursery window since they'd brought the child in. The nurses were used to his presence by now, some even warmed up to him, murmuring soft words as they passed, but he had no ears for them. His watch was solely on the baby. Each morning, Hayley Stanton entered just after sunrise. It had become her ritual as much as it was Laika's duty. She would swing by the coffee shop down the street, then slip into the hospital with her usual measured steps, a murmur of a greeting to the staff, but her heart set on the small, fragile figure in the bassinet near the window. And there was Laika, guarding his place, nose pressed against the glass, a silent sentinel. On the third morning, as Hayley approached, she noticed Laika's head turn. His deep, intelligent eyes flicked over her, assessing, then relaxed. Hayley found herself compelled to reach out, almost involuntarily, to run a hand along his head. The fur was coarse and damp, and Laika gave a low, appreciative rumble, closing his eyes for just a second. "You're a good dog," she said softly, crouching down. "And you've stayed, haven't you? You don't want to leave him either." Laika's tail tapped against the floor, and he nosed toward the nursery glass, his message unmistakable. He wasn't going anywhere. In the room beyond, the baby lay nestled under layers of white blankets, cheeks soft and pale, a little wrinkled hand peeking out. Hayley leaned her forehead against the glass, observing the rise and fall of his tiny chest. She could hear the nurses' soft coos as they moved around the crib, but Hayley's mind wandered, touched by a melancholy she hadn't anticipated. She wondered once again about the mother who'd abandoned him, about the reasons someone might leave a child behind in a cold alley on a rainy night. When she straightened, Laika's eyes were on her. There was something resolute in the way he watched her, as if reading her thoughts, a silent communication Hayley found strangely comforting. Over the next week, this unspoken bond grew, and her quick morning visits stretched a little longer each day. She started bringing a bit of her breakfast for Laika, offering him torn-off bits of bagel or a corner of her sandwich. He'd accept them with quiet dignity, then resume his vigil, his nose pressed to the glass, watching every move inside that little room. Hayley felt the responsibility growing, knotting itself into her chest each day as she watched the baby grow just a bit stronger, kick his little feet just a little higher. She found herself wondering what would happen to him after he was discharged. He had no one. His future stretched ahead like a blank sheet, waiting to be filled. She didn't know what she'd expected at first. A mother might come forward, a family member, some answer from the shadows, but there'd been nothing, just the child and the dog, bonded by silence, waiting for something they could not name. One rainy afternoon, when the hospital was quieter than usual, she brought herself a stool to sit beside Laika. They sat together in that stillness, a woman and a dog, bound by a common, unspoken sense of duty to this vulnerable new life. Laika would occasionally look up at her with those deep-set eyes, and Hayley would find herself resting a hand on his back, comforted by his quiet, steady presence. The baby stirred, a thin wail piercing the silence. Laika's ears pricked, his eyes fixed on the crib. Hayley couldn't resist a small smile. "I think he knows you're here," she murmured, glancing at Laika. He huffed softly as if to agree, a rumble of reassurance that seemed to ease the boy's cries. Hayley felt a tug at her heart. This wasn't just a dog, and this wasn't just any baby. There was something profoundly unique in the silent devotion Laika had for this child, an unbreakable bond forged in one impossible night and woven into every day since. The next morning, Haley found herself asking the nurse about the child's future, about the plans for foster care, about the list of adoptive families. She couldn't shake the image of the child's small hand against her own, the soft warmth of Laika against her leg as they sat in silent companionship. Laika was there, nose against the glass, waiting for her to arrive. Haley stood beside him, watching the child sleep, her heart as unyielding as the old dog's. Haley had come to know the morning rhythm of the hospital, nurses moving softly down the hallways, patients' quiet voices behind closed doors, the hum of machines breaking the silence. She'd found peace in those hours, slipping into the nursery just after sunrise to sit beside Laika and the baby. But today, her quiet routine was interrupted. It started when she noticed a stranger in a trim grey suit, moving with a quick, purposeful stride down the corridor. He carried a leather binder and wore a look of seasoned authority that spoke of years making tough calls. Haley's pulse quickened, a small ripple of unease building in her chest. She'd seen that look before. Social services. The man didn't linger, didn't hesitate. He was soon in the nursery, speaking to the nurses in hushed tones. Haley tried to hear through the glass, catching fragments of words like ward of the state and temporary placement. She felt a chill. When he stepped out, she met his eyes, expecting the usual bureaucratic pleasantries. But he simply nodded, curt, as though he had no time for small talk. "Officer Stanton, I believe?" he asked, his tone polite but brisk. She nodded, feeling her throat tighten. "Yes, I'm Haley Stanton," she replied. Her voice sounded too loud in the quiet hallway. "Good. I'm Agent Mays from Social Services." He glanced back at the nursery, his face unreadable. "We're here to arrange the infant's transfer to a foster home. It's time he's placed under proper care." She felt a weight settle in her stomach. Proper care? And the dog? Ah, yes. He glanced down the hall as if he'd barely noticed the silent, scruffy sentinel. "There's protocol, Officer Stanton. The dog will be taken to the Animal Control Center. A stray can't stay in a hospital." His voice was firm, as if he'd rehearsed the words 100 times before. He didn't pause to consider her reaction, just nodded at the nurse, who arrived to help him with the baby. Haley stepped back, processing the words. She tried to protest, but it came out like a whisper. "He's attached. They're both attached." Mays didn't seem to hear. He gave a quiet directive to the nurse, and before Haley could intervene, he'd already reached into the crib, lifting the baby in his practiced hands. Laika, waiting loyally by the nursery door, instantly sensed something was wrong. His ears pricked, and he let out a low, anxious whine, pacing toward Mays and the baby. The agent barely glanced at the dog. "Someone get this animal out of here." A young orderly stepped forward, his movements cautious. He reached down, trying to steer Laika back from the door. But Laika wouldn't budge. His whine grew louder, a mix of desperation and determination that caught everyone's attention. He let out a bark, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed down the hall. Haley could feel her heart beating fast as she watched, trapped between rules and reason. "Stop it!" she found herself saying, louder than she intended. She stepped forward, but before she could reach him, Laika was growling, his stance lowering as if he'd fight anyone who tried to take the baby. And as if in response, the baby began to cry, a wail that matched Laika's distress, the sound stretching down the corridor like a siren. The young orderly faltered, stepping back, wide-eyed. "Ma'am, we need to—" Haley raised her hand to silence him. She moved toward Laika, her voice low. "Hey, it's okay, Leica," she murmured, dropping to a crouch. "No one's hurting him. We're just moving him, okay?" But Leica wouldn't stop. He began to howl, a mournful, guttural sound that rose and fell with a haunting rhythm, one that seemed to ripple through every corner of the hospital. The baby's cries grew louder, shrill and insistent, reaching out to Leica as if he understood, and, watching them both, Haley felt the first hot tear slip down her cheek. Her throat tightened as she realized just how much this bond had rooted itself into her heart. I can't," she whispered to herself, barely able to stand the sound, the sight of Leica clawing at the nursery door, the baby's tiny hand reaching out in helpless protest. She tried to steel herself, reminded herself she was a police officer, trained to handle tension and heartbreak. But the sight of Leica, desperate and unyielding, tore down all those defenses. Agent Mays looked over at her, eyebrows raised in impatience. "Officer Stanton, please. The animal's being taken care of. The child, too. There's no need for sentiment." His words stung like a slap. Haley straightened, watching as the nurses moved forward to take the baby away, Leica's howls echoing through the hall. Her heart hammered, the sound of the cries binding the three of them in a painful, invisible chain. When it was over, the hallway fell silent, leaving her alone with the echo of the baby's cries and Leica's haunting wails imprinted on her heart. Haley knew one thing with fierce certainty: this wasn't over. She couldn't turn her back on them. The decision settled in Haley's heart like a quiet storm. She'd fought it for days, told herself she wasn't in the position to take in a baby and a dog, both so utterly dependent. But that small boy with his wife, trusting eyes, and Leica, the ever-watchful guardian, they weren't like anything she'd ever known. They'd come into her life together, bound by whatever tragedy had brought them there, and she couldn't ignore the weight that kept pulling her back to them. Haley's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as she approached the hospital nursery one last time, as a visitor. She paused outside the door, where Leica sat dutifully, his ears perked the moment he saw her. The dog looked up at her, his expression somber, almost as if he could sense what she was about to say. Haley crouched beside him, scratching behind his ears. "Well, Leica, looks like you're coming home with me. Both of you are." She let out a slow breath, feeling the tension leave her shoulders, as if she'd just signed a silent pact. Leica gave a soft, approving whine, nudging his nose against her hand. The adoption paperwork, though, was no small task. But Haley was resourceful. She knew people, had contacts in places that could ease the process. With a few favors called in and some back and forth between departments, she managed to cut through the red tape. It took time, some early mornings and late nights, but each step brought her closer to bringing the boy home. She was grateful, deeply so, to the colleagues who pulled strings, to the quiet glances and nods of support from people she hadn't even expected it from. In her heart, it felt as if the whole department was silently rooting for her. Then came the day she finally brought the child and Leica through her own front door. Haley's husband, Joseph, stood by, his arms crossed over his chest, a small frown pulling at his mouth. She knew him well enough to sense the slight tension in his stance. He wasn't a man who adjusted easily to changes, especially ones as big as this. He looked at the baby, then at Leica, who stared back with his usual stoic intensity. "Haley," he began, his voice calm but firm, "are we really ready for this?" Haley nodded, her voice quiet but resolute. "Joseph, I can't explain it. I just know that this is right. They need us. And I think we might need them too." Joseph let out a long breath, eyes drifting over to the baby in Haley's arms. The child was dozing softly, nestled in the blanket Haley had carefully wrapped him in, one small fist curled around her finger. Joseph's face softened just a little, his gaze tender. "Well," he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, "I trust you, Haley. If you believe this is something we can do, then we'll do it." Relief washed over her. Haley reached out, squeezing his hand, and together they brought the baby into the living room, where they laid him gently in the bassinet she'd managed to borrow from a neighbor. Laika, never far behind, settled down beside the bassinet, his chin resting on the edge, eyes half closed in that calm, watchful way of his. Over the following days, the household slowly began to adjust, like a new rhythm settling in. Joseph's mornings became quieter, less hurried, as he'd pause by the bassinet before leaving for work, watching the baby's tiny movements with quiet fascination. On weekends, he'd surprise Haley by bringing home little toys or soft blankets, things he'd find during his errands, even though he'd grumble under his breath about the extra work. For Haley, everything felt different. She left work earlier, her once stoic focus softened, each day bringing her closer to this small, unexpected family. Her colleagues noticed her subtle shifts. There were fewer late nights. Her weekends were now filled with sounds of laughter and the soft patter of Laika's paws as he followed her around the house, ever vigilant. And slowly, the little house felt warmer. The evenings brought a soft light as Haley and Joseph would sit on the couch, Laika lying across their feet, the baby cradled in Haley's arms. Joseph, once so wary, would gently brush his fingers over the child's small hand, a faint smile on his lips. Haley watched, her heart full, knowing that this was just the beginning of something neither of them had planned, but was somehow exactly what they both needed. A quiet happiness settled over them, deepening with each shared moment, each touch of small fingers and gentle sighs. The boy and Laika had brought something intangible into their lives, a sense of purpose, of unity, that neither Haley nor Joseph had known they were missing. In the end, the decision hadn't just changed the boy's life or Laika's, it had woven them all into something bigger, something lasting, that they would cherish, day by day. It started slow, almost unnoticeable. Joseph would walk past the crib with just a quick, uncertain glance at first, hands deep in his pockets, his eyes lingering a second longer each time. The baby was so small, so fragile, and it had been years since their daughter, Emily, was that tiny. Haley caught him a few times just watching, something softening in his expression before he'd clear his throat and turn away. But over time, that caution faded. Haley started finding him leaning over the crib, murmuring quiet words to the baby, or simply standing there, fingers tracing the edge of the railing as if he was building a connection wordlessly. One night, he even tried his hand at the midnight bottle, tiptoeing back to bed with a shy, proud smile as the baby drifted back to sleep. "Guess he's warming up to us, huh?" he'd said, sliding under the covers, careful not to wake Haley. But she'd been awake, eyes half open, the comfort of that moment settling around them like a warm blanket. Day by day, Joseph found himself more at ease around the little one. He'd sit with the baby in his arms, eyes wide in wonder as those tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, as if claiming him as their own. The baby, too, responded in kind, his gaze always following Joseph's voice, a faint smile curving his little mouth whenever Joseph laughed or sang a quiet tune. Emily, however, had fallen for the baby in a heartbeat. The first time she held him, she'd looked up at Haley, with a grin stretched wide, pride and wonder filling her eyes. "He's my little brother, right?" she'd asked, her voice holding that innocent certainty that only children could possess. From that day on, Emily barely left his side, her toys scattered around the baby's playmate, her laughter filling the house as she pretended to teach him the alphabet or tell him wild stories of princesses and dragons. When the baby gurgled in response, Emily would break into peals of giggles, wrapping her tiny arms around him in a gentle hug. Watching them together, Haley felt something settle, an assurance that they were building a bond stronger than blood. Laika, on the other hand, took his protective role as seriously as ever. Wherever the baby went, Laika followed. He'd lie beside the crib, eyes watchful, a low, contented rumble vibrating through him whenever the baby stirred. In the evenings, as Haley and Joseph relaxed in the living room, Laika would trot over to the couch, lying close to Haley's feet with his gaze fixed on the baby. He'd even learned to endure Emily's enthusiastic hugs, his tail thumping the floor as she whispered secrets into his ear, making him her silent partner in crime. Once, when a neighbor stopped by to drop off a casserole, Laika had stationed himself by the baby's stroller, casting the visitor a wary look. Haley had chuckled, patting his head to reassure him, feeling grateful for this steadfast companion who seemed to understand her worries without a single word. As the days turned to weeks, Haley found herself breathing easier, the fear and uncertainty that had once filled her heart slowly replaced by a quiet, grounding happiness. She watched Joseph laughing with Emily as she jiggled a rattle above the baby's head, the baby's face lighting up with pure delight. She felt Laika nudging her hand, his steady presence a comfort that was now woven into their lives as naturally as breathing. One night, as they sat together on the porch, the baby cradled in Haley's arms, she glanced at Joseph, their daughter sleeping soundly in her bed, Laika lying peacefully by her side. The house, once quiet and orderly, was now alive, filled with the sounds of laughter, the soft coos of a baby, the gentle patter of paws. She knew then that they had become something more than they'd ever planned, a family in the truest sense. Haley took a deep breath, letting the warmth of that moment settle in her chest, pride and gratitude mingling in her heart. This was it, she realized. This was family. Not just the people you were born to, but the ones you choose to love, to protect, to nurture. She reached for Joseph's hand, giving it a squeeze. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice catching. "For what?" he asked, glancing down at her with a gentle smile. "For this," she replied, looking out at their home, their children, and the loyal dog who had stayed, who had made this possible. "For helping me see what family really means." Every morning, Haley woke before dawn, slipping out of bed and heading down the hall, where she found Laika curled up at the foot of the crib. The dog's ears flicked at her approach, lifting his head as she walked into the room. Little Ethan, as they had named him, was fast asleep, his tiny fists clenched under his chin, and Haley felt a familiar warmth envelop her, a feeling that had grown since the first night she held him in the hospital. She bent down, patting Laika gently on the head. "Morning, boy," she whispered. Laika's tail gave a soft thump against the floor, and he lowered his head back down, content to watch over the baby as the sun rose. Life had shifted in a way she hadn't anticipated. Every day brought a new rhythm, from early morning feedings to quiet moments spent on the back porch with Ethan cradled in her arms, Laika at her feet, and Joseph watching them from the doorway, a soft smile on his face. Her husband's initial hesitation was giving way to something more genuine, a connection Haley knew he'd never expected to feel. As the days turned into weeks, Haley and Joseph found themselves navigating the unexpected joy and chaos that came with raising a baby. They quickly learned Ethan's signals. A small whimper meant he was hungry, a louder cry was his signal for attention, and when he laughed, a sound like a chime that filled every corner of their home. Their hearts swelled. Laika followed them wherever they went, a quiet shadow, his loyalty unbreakable, and more than once Haley caught herself looking at the dog with a deep gratitude she couldn't put into words. Friends and family came by, filling their house with warmth and congratulations. Her mother, who hadn't expected Haley to take on such a sudden change, softened when she saw Ethan reach his small hands toward her, his fingers wrapping around her thumb. "You're doing a good thing, Haley," she'd said quietly, her voice catching. "He's going to have a wonderful life here." But the journey wasn't without its hurdles. The legal process to adopt Ethan was long, tangled with paperwork and meetings, each requiring Haley to reaffirm her commitment. She sat through hours of interviews, answered countless questions about her capacity to raise a child, and each time she left those meetings, she felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. Joseph was there beside her through it all, a steady presence, though she knew he struggled with the weight of it in his own way. One afternoon, after a particularly lengthy session, Joseph caught Haley's hand as they walked out of the building. "You sure you're up for all of this?" he asked, his brow furrowed, the concern evident in his eyes. Haley smiled, giving his hand a firm squeeze. "We're in this together. Every step. I've got no doubts, Joseph." She looked back toward the car, where Laika waited patiently, and thought of the quiet strength in those brown eyes, the way he'd sat by that crib night after night, as if promising he'd stay as long as he was needed. And so they continued, weaving together a life that, while unexpected, was theirs, in every sense. Ethan grew stronger each day, his laughter echoing through their home, filling every corner with a warmth Haley hadn't realized was missing. The house itself seemed to change with each passing week, becoming less of a place they lived in and more of a sanctuary, a safe harbor for each of them, including Laika. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Ethan nestled in Haley's arms, Laika resting beside her on the floor, and Joseph flipping through a children's book he'd picked up on a whim. Haley looked around and felt the full weight of contentment settle over her. "We're a family, aren't we?" she said quietly, almost to herself. Joseph glanced over, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, Haley, we are." Ethan let out a soft coo, his eyes wide and curious as he looked up at her, and Laika shifted, pressing his head gently against Haley's knee, as if echoing Joseph's sentiment in his own silent way. Haley ran a hand over Laika's fur, feeling the unspoken promise between them, the shared duty of guardianship, the love that had grown, slow but strong, binding them all together. For the first time in years, Haley felt no lingering shadows, no doubt. The weight of the legal battles ahead, the countless unknowns of parenthood, even the small fears that came with loving something so deeply, all of it felt like a part of the journey now. She wasn't walking it alone. They were here, all of them, together. With a sigh of quiet contentment, she leaned back, cradling Ethan as he drifted to sleep in her arms. Laika's eyes closed, his body relaxing, and Joseph turned a page, his voice low as he began to read. Haley watched them all, feeling the completeness settle in. It's truly a story about resilience, loyalty, and the unexpected bonds that can create a family. If you were touched by Haley's decision to embrace this new chapter, by the way Laika stayed loyally by Ethan's side, or by Joseph's quiet strength, then remember, sometimes families found in the most unlikely of places. Thank you all for staying with us to the end of this heartwarming tale. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the bell for more incredible stories like this. Share this video if you felt inspired by Haley's journey. And remember, you never know how one small act of kindness can change a life. See you in the next video, and until then, take care and keep spreading the love.